Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muñiz.
I am so excited about today, Azaii. Today, we're talking about memory. And those of you who know me know that memory is, of all the biology topics, the one that I'm most interested in. Just a little bit of background. I think most people know me, but my name's Phil Hawkins, went to the University of Nebraska Med Center where I was an MD PhD student, and I did a lot of my PhD work studying memory, the way that we learn things and how memory kind of works overall. Generally, it was in the context of Alzheimer's, but really the reason I was focused on that is because I had to learn so much stuff, and I want to hold on to that information. And I know we did a podcast episode, I think it was the very first podcast, where we talked a little bit about how memory works. So today we're going to be talking about memory. I should hold off and back up a bit. The reason we're doing this is because we're going through the AAMC Psych outline. We're still in 6B, so we did part of 6A, part of 6B. We're doing another part of 6B today. We're not going to talk about every single topic, but we are going to talk about some of the highest yield stuff. And today I'm excited because we get to talk about memory. Azaii, how do you feel about memory?
Yeah. So also, I think most folks know a little bit about me. So my name is Azaii Muñiz, and I am a second-year medical student. Right now, as we're recording this, I'm actually in the neurology and psychology block. And so as of this morning, I was looking at some of the structures that play a role in memory. So a little bit of a different perspective, but very interested, very excited to be doing this. I like learning about memory in part because I feel like I get invested, right? And then the more you're invested in what you're learning about, the easier it becomes to actually learn about it. But I think it's also, like, in a sense, and specific to the MCAT, kind of like easy points, right? Because you can come up with these amazing examples and also very simple examples. And it really is a great playground. So I like the mental acrobatics, so to speak, of coming up with different ideas, different things to remember. I'll stop one of these days. Yeah. So remember the different terms when we're talking about memory.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things that's immediately 100% relevant to people who are studying for the MCAT. Like, how does memory work? I am trying to memorize like a whole pile of stuff. And so this is important, like how memory works. So to do just kind of a brief overview, we're going to talk about each of these different types of memory more in depth, but the AAMC expects you to know how memory moves between different types of memory. Turns out all memories are not the same. There is sensory memory, which is not what you probably think it is. There is, so from there, memories will, when you first take in information, you see something. You have sensory memory, which will move to a short-term memory, which may be encoded into a long-term memory. Encoding is the process of kind of I like to create an analogy of writing something down. If I had a piece of information I needed for my taxes, and my taxes aren't due for a while, what I would do is I would write that on a Post-it note, stick it in my filing cabinet, and then when tax time rolled around, pull out that Post-it note. And so encoding is creating that long-term memory. After that, you'll need to store it. And then eventually, when you need that information, you need to retrieve it. So those are the three big steps in long-term memory. There is encoding, storage, and retrieval. And you can have issues with any one of those steps, which leads to a whole bunch of really interesting memory disorders, like different types of amnesia that aren't all they can be very different. And so we're going to talk about each of these different types of memory a little bit more in depth. But I think it's good to kind of take a step back and just kind of understand how memory moves between these different categories.
Yeah, so I can get us started on sensory memory. So like Phil said, this is probably not what you think it is. So it is not your memory of senses. So for example, students will often think, I know how roses smell, right? Rose is the one thing that everyone knows how it smells, or coffee. Your memory of that, you can retrieve it. You can, you can recognize it. You can recall it. We'll talk about all of those the differences later on. But the sensory memory is actually a split second. It's less than a second, maybe 2 seconds max. And it's based on neurotransmitter activity. So the moment that you are able to actively engage with that memory and work with it to move it into short-term memory, it's no longer sensory memory. So the way I like to think about it is you might feel the wind brush against your arm for that split second, but you don't remember what it feels like later on because you didn't actively use that memory. It didn't move into short-term memory. So sensory memory, very, very brief, like flitting. It's almost like an idea that comes and just races right through your mind, and then you can't remember what it is. It's analogous to that with sensory memory.
Yeah, especially that, like, it kind of flits in and out. I think an important thing with sensory memory is it's entirely subconscious. You are not aware of the memories you are making when they're sensory memories. And there can be different types of sensory memories. They're all based on their senses, like vision or like touch or hearing things. To just kind of like create some context to this. I think this is very tricky for students to understand. Like, let's say that I showed you an image from a movie. And it was like a guy and a girl sitting down, and like the guy's got his hand up and his mouth open. If I ask you, what's the plot of this scene? Nobody knows, right? But if I showed you that image and then the image that came after, and then the image that came after, you'd be like, oh, he's proposing and she is saying no, and now he wants to know why. And you can like stitch this together. And so when you are experiencing the world around you, you need to be able to stitch like what just happened to what's happening now. And so all of your sensory information is being held for just a couple of seconds in order for you to stitch it together and make sense of it. There's lots of really great examples of this. Iconic memory, a good example of this is the double take, where you like look over, you look back, and then you realize, oh my gosh, Keanu Reeves is fighting a polar bear over there, just off screen. And like it takes a second, like it took you a second to realize what you saw. Your brain was holding on to that image subconsciously so that you could process it and figure out what it was. That would be an iconic sensory memory because it's based on the visual system. There's also echoic, which is based on sound. My favorite example of echoic is like, I was like playing video games as a kid, and I'm like trying not to die. I'm like, oh, I'm like right on the razor's edge. And my mom's like comes in and is trying to talk to me. I am totally not paying attention. And she'll be like talking, and I'm like just zoned in on the video game. And she's like, what did I just say? And I'm like, take out the trash before dinner. And then I'm like playing. I had no idea. But because she said like, take out the trash before dinner, what did I just say? My brain had been holding on to that sound information subconsciously for just a couple of seconds. If my mom had said, take out the trash before dinner, what did I just say? I couldn't have answered because I wasn't actively paying attention. But your brain is holding on to all of this sensory information coming in through all these different types, and it's holding on to it subconsciously just for a couple seconds so you can try to make sense of it. Another example of echoic, which would be the sound, would be like when you talk to somebody and they have a very thick accent or they're mumbling and they say something and it takes you a second. You're like, oh, I know what they said. Like it just took me a second to process. I was holding on to those sounds and trying to stitch those together in a way that made sense to me. And so I just want to like reiterate that like sensory memory is not like, I remember what like the lilacs outside my kitchen growing up smelled like. I remember like what my house looked like, the weird color it was growing up, or I remember, what it feels like to walk on a beach. Those are memory of senses, but those are not sensory memories. And so like you got to be really careful there. Because if I was an MCAT test writer and I really wanted to test who understood sensory memory, that's how I would do it, as I would have some things in there about memories of senses. And that's not what a sensory memory is.
Yeah, I think the two words that come to mind when I think of sensory memory are, wait, what? Right? Because with the double take, it's, wait, what did I just see? Right? Mm-hmm. With your mom talking to you, it was like, wait, what did she just say? With the feeling with haptic, it's, wait, what was that I just felt on my arm? Right? Or on my hand, whatever it may be. When in doubt, wait, what?
Yeah.
You don't want to wait.
Right. Yeah. The haptic feedback is there's iconic, which is visual, echoic, which is sound. Haptic is a little bit weirder because most people don't really use haptic feedback or haptic sensory memory that often. One example of that, though, is people who are blind who are reading Braille. When they're running their fingers across the bumps, they need to remember what were the bumps I just ran over in order to stitch those together to make a word. And so haptic sensory memory is touch-based. So given that we have this like information coming in, it's all subconscious, we can take it and pull it into the conscious realm or the short-term memory. So when my mom says like, what did I just say? I pull that information up and now it's short-term memory. I'm utilizing this and I'm aware of it. And so we're moving from sensory memory to short-term. I actually kind of am annoyed by the name short-term memory, but we discovered like long-term and short-term first. And so it made sense to have a long and a short. And then we discovered sensory memory, which is actually shorter than short-term memory. So short-term should be called middle term, but we're not going to like go back and change that despite how I feel we should. So this like short-term memory is like a big component of short-term memory is the working memory, which is like my favorite name. Like the short-term memory is a bad name, but working memory is a great name because in order to hold something in your working memory, it requires work, it requires effort. Like if I was, this is always an experiment I like to do with my students, is I'm like, okay, so I'm going to give you a math problem and you have to solve it in your head without writing it down. You have as much time as you want, but if you don't get it right, you're dead. Like a lightning bolt comes from the sky. So like no pressure, but like you got to answer this math question to live. And it's 286 divided by 13. And I know most of you out there are like, well, I'm dead, right? But if you have infinite time and you can like hold it in your head, 286 divided by 13, you can take this and you can like maybe try to figure it out. You can be like, well, 13 times 10 is 130. So 13 times 20 will be 260. I need 286. So I need 26 more. So that'll be 22. So like 286 divided by 13 is 22. I'm like, if you have all the time in the world, you can solve this. But note that is, you're holding all these numbers in your head and that takes a lot of work. And so that's a working memory sort of thing. And it takes constant effort. If I stopped you in the middle of that math problem and asked like, what's your phone number? Like you could tell me your phone number, but then you'd have to restart. You can't just pick up where you left off because working memory requires this constant effort. Yeah, working memory, super good name. Short-term memory, needs a better name, but we'll stick with them for now.
And I just want to add something to this. So you mentioned that when we go, basically we're pulling it into our conscience, right? So we're giving it our attention. And the reason I want to bring this up is to all of you future doctors out there, because that's your goal, right? You're actually going to have to learn to differentiate between an attention issue versus a memory issue, because an issue with attention causes what appears to be an issue with memory. And so when you do, and you'll get to this in medical school, you have plenty of time to learn about this, but this is a short story time and a little bit of preview. You'll have to do mini mental exams. And so you're going to have to say, okay, repeat numbers back to me, right? So thinking about attention, whether they're actually listening, whether they're able to pay attention.
This is for a patient to like examine, like if their brain is working properly, like a mini mental exam. Exactly.
And so something else that you'll often have to do is basically give them 3 words and then have them repeat them back to you. Now, if you're not paying attention, then you might think, okay, well, they couldn't repeat them back to me. So that was an issue with their memory. But what if they were tying their shoes while you were giving them those 3 words, right? That is no longer a memory issue. That's an attention issue. So when we talk about bringing it into our conscious, right, we also have to keep in mind that it's our attention that we're giving to this information that is in our sensory memory and being brought into our short-term memory. So small distinction, but it's a useful one in the future when you are all future doctors.
Right. Yeah. You want to be really aware of that, like doing a mini mental exam, like you come in and like, oh, this patient couldn't remember like the 3 words I told him to remember, but like the patient also had his leg crushed and he's like, his problem isn't memory. His problem is he's in so much pain. He can't focus on things besides the pain. His attention is being pulled to that one topic. So you don't want to be like, we should probably like, do like a neuro exam on this guy because he didn't remember that I told him to remember the word dromedary. Well, maybe he was like thinking and paying attention to other things. But this also kind of goes into like, there's a certain limit to how much stuff you can hold in your short-term memory and this like working memory. Like if I asked you guys, 5,872,462.3 divided by the square root of 17. Nobody answers that question. Most of you couldn't even tell me what the question was. I can't. I literally just said it, but like I don't remember what that number was. The square root of 17 was something, and the other one started with 5 million, which is like actually like another thing that I remember the first thing I said and the last thing I said that was totally unintentional, but that's the primacy and recency effect. We're not going to go into that today. That is another MCAT term though, or a couple of MCAT terms. But there tends to be like a set amount of stuff that you can handle, like a set volume and a set time frame. Remind me of that, Azaii.
Yeah, so it's usually about 7 plus or minus 2. And so that's why when we're thinking about the number that Phil was trying to throw at us and trick us with, after a certain point, right, our minds are like, okay, 5 million. I don't know about you, but I was trying to place the zeros. And the moment I did that, I was lost because that was more numbers in a row than my brain could handle in that moment, aside from everything else that was going on in that wonderful example. So it's usually about 5 to 9. So 7 being the average. It also depends on the complexity of the items, right? So things that are easier will lean more towards that 9. But if you have to memorize, or remember totally different topics or words that you can't put together easily, that's going to take a little bit more effort. And so you'll probably lean more towards 5. But again, that's an estimate.
And there are a lot of different tricks for dealing with this, which is also some MCAT terms like chunking and things like that we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but do know that they're on the AAMC outline and you do need to be familiar with them. We're just talking about the most complex, the highest yield stuff here. But for example, with the chunking thing, like 8, 6, 4, 3, 1, 7, it's actually easier to remember 86, 43, 17. It's the same number of digits, but like if you remember 86, 43, 17, that's really just 3 numbers, even though it's the same number of digits. So you're chunking and grouping these into groups, which makes it easier to handle that. There are some people out there like saying 5 to 9. There are some people out there that can remember way more than that, like some really amazing like things, people go on like talk shows and stuff like that. And you see them do this like insane math in their head. But most people it's around like 7, plus or minus a little bit. Yeah.
And you mentioned the chunking phone numbers. Mm-hmm. This is like, if you think about it, right, I had to sit down and say, okay, how many numbers are in a phone number? So it's 334. So that's a total of 10. So it's a little bit just on the higher end, right? But that's what we do. We chunk them. We put them together. We remember them in groups of 3, remember them in a group of 4. We might just do a number, right? If it's like 1, 2, 3, you'll do like 123, whatever, etc. And so granted, that moves into our long-term memory eventually, but when you first get a new phone number, that's how you remember it for a little bit each time to be able to tell someone your phone number after you've just seen it.
Right. Another example with phone numbers and short-term memory, I wasn't going to go into this, but we're talking about phone numbers now, so we might as well.
Oops.
That another thing that happens with working memory, it's like trying to hold working memory, short-term memory. It only lasts like around 30-ish seconds, plus or minus, kind of depending on what's going on with the person or the patient or the student or whoever. But the thing is, it takes a lot of constant effort. So if you're trying to hold something in your short-term memory for longer than that, you might do something like a phonologic loop. So like, let's say I was talking to Jennifer Aniston and Jennifer Aniston was like, hey, Phil, here's my phone number. Call me sometime. And if I don't have my phone and I don't have a pen and I can't write it down, like I need this to hold on to this number. Jennifer Aniston just told me to call her. So like what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the phone number out loud, like 8675309. And I'm going to hear that. And that's going to go into my short-term memory. And so I'm going to say it again. And then I'm going to hear it again. And then I'm going to say it again and then hear it again. So I'm just going to be like 8675309, 8675309, 8675309. Somebody give me a pen. 8675309, 8675309. Note that once again, if that gets interrupted, that's the phonological loop, is like holding this thing in your short-term memory for a while. If somebody gave me a math problem as I'm trying to remember that phone number, I'm going to lose it because it's like this like short-term memory. We can only hold on to it for so long. Now, if something is important enough, we can shift that to long-term memory. Long-term memory, I just want to take a second here and like shine a flashlight on just how awesome long-term memory is. I don't think students appreciate how amazing long-term memory is. You can be 95 and remember something that happened to you when you were 5. That's mind blowing. If I wrote something on a piece of paper and then just set it on my desk in 90 years, I'm not going to have that information. Even if I like store that on like a flash drive, there's something known as like data decay. And like, there's a good chance that even if I kept that flash drive, that information won't still be there 90 years from then. And, like imagining the ways that we can like hold on to information. Your brain holds on to a lot of information for a long time. And that's amazing. And it's not active, right? Like it's subconscious. Like I remember my kindergarten teacher was named Miss Francis. That when my second grade teacher was Miss Jacklovich, and then Miss Rhodes, and then Mrs. Norton. And like this, like I got all these teachers. I haven't thought about those people in decades, but like that information is there. And so if I need to pull that up, if I need to retrieve that information to the conscious realm, to the short-term memory, I can do it. I can pull that up. And so we have that, like, if stuff seems really important, we'll encode that. We'll take that information, put that into long-term storage. We'll hold it there until we need it, and then we'll retrieve that. And so that's like a super interesting thing, that we have this like cold storage almost that can hold on to information for a long time.
Yeah. So we also have different types of long-term memory. But before that, I actually want to touch a little bit on the process of encoding. So when you think about that encoding, right, we've established that it's important. So if, Phil mentioned the phonological loop, right? So just repeating the numbers. So that's acoustic, right? So you're hearing yourself say it, you're repeating it. That if we tried to encode all of our experiences acoustically, it would not be as actually strong as semantic encoding. So giving meaning to the ideas, the experiences that we have. And it's that, like Phil mentioned, that degree of importance that we've attributed to it, that meaningfulness that we've attributed to it, that when we pair it with the meaning of the experience, right? Or the meaning of the phone number that you mentioned, like our phone numbers are meaningful to us. Then that provides that makes it easier to encode the memory as a long-term memory.
Right.
So we mentioned that we have different, and Phil, I don't know if you wanted to jump into.
No, I just want to say, like, the opposite example, it would be like some stuff that is just not important enough to encode. Like if I ask you, what did you have for breakfast 72 days ago? Like most people probably couldn't tell me, right? There are a couple of amazing memories out there that could, but the vast majority of mortal human beings could not say like, oh, I had like we were out of bread, so normally I have toast, but I didn't have toast that day. I just had eggs and some hash browns. And like that's not a normal scenario. So most things we actually don't take and put into long term. We don't encode it unless it seems particularly meaningful, particularly important. But
yeah. For sure. I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast 72 days ago. I probably couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast 3 days ago, but that's a whole other story. So the first major category of long-term memory that we can access is the explicit memory. So you'll also hear it called declarative memory. And it's essentially facts, right? So facts, ideas, experiences. So that branches off into.
I always thought about it as things you can explain or things you can declare, and so it's the explicit or declarative, basically the same thing.
Yeah. So it breaks into two subcategories, types of memory. So we have the episodic and we have the semantic. So episodic, as the name implies, is kind of like if you were to play an episode of an experience you had, right? So an event. So this morning, I could tell you. One of my memories, right, will be of getting on the shuttle this morning with some classmates and making our way over to class. And I can tell you some of the conversations we had, but if I play it back as almost like a TV show, right, I can give you a lot more information. On the other hand, we have semantic memory. So this is going to be more general facts. So things that we know to be true. So for example, we know who the president is right now. That's something that we all know. It's not specific to an event that I experienced as an individual. So those are the two main categories. I think the president example is the one that gets used most often. But day, right? The day of the month, something that you'll be asking your patients, right? What's the year? So these are the type of things that you expect everyone to really know.
Yeah, that's a huge thing in medicine, because if you want to check somebody's semantic memory, like it's tricky because there are some facts that people don't know. Like if I ask somebody like, what's the capital of Arkansas? There are some people who just like, it's not that their memory is bad. They just don't know the answer. Most people know who the president is or what year it is. So those are good, like safe things to just assume somebody knows. But yeah, and that the thing is that's different than episodic. And the reason we know it's different is because people will have issues with one of these or another. And like these are medically relevant. It's not just we just decided to categorize memories in different types, but like these memories are stored differently and they're retrieved differently. And so somebody might have an issue with experiences. They can't remember like experiences overall. They might have problems with episodic memory. So there's a difference between I know Little Rock is the capital of Arkansas and I remember going to Little Rock. And like one of those, the first one is a semantic, the second one's an episodic memory. And so those are slightly different, not quite the same thing. One thing to note is that those memories are mostly in the hippocampal region of the brain and like some areas around there. But there are other, like most of the time when we think about memories, that's the sort of stuff we're thinking about anyway. Like I remember like all the stuff I'm memorizing for the MCAT. I remember where my house is. I remember who my mom is. I remember my birthday, like all of those. That's generally what we think about when we think about memory. But there are other types of long-term memories. One of them, and like the main one besides the explicit or declarative, is the implicit memory. This is a lot more interesting, at least to me, because it turns out that you have memories that you're not aware of. Implicit memories are ones that you cannot explain. The explicit ones, you can explain to me about your writing in on the shuttle. You can explain to me about facts. But there are some things you have learned that are long-term memories that you can't explain. Things like how to walk. Now that seems like a super obvious thing and everyone's like, well, it's right foot, left foot. I promise you, talk to somebody who had a stroke, talk to somebody who like doesn't know how to walk and say like, oh, it's right foot, left foot. Like it's way more complex than that. You have to flex muscles in your abdomen and like in certain orders. Like most people don't even know what those muscles are, let alone which ones to flex, right? Like most people don't even know how many muscles there are in their abdomen, but they know how to walk. They know how to utilize those. And like to walk, when you start to walk forward or when you accelerate, you have to lean forward. And when you like slow down, you have to lean back. And like, what do you do with your right arm when you step forward with your right foot? Does the right hand go forward with the right foot or the opposite? And like, I literally am like trying to figure that out now. I walk all the time. I mean, not to brag, but I can walk. But like, if you ask me to explain what do I do when I'm walking, I'm like, I'm not really that sure. And so these are things that are a lot more subconscious. They're actually stored not in the like the main forebrain, but more in the like cerebellum, which is Latin for little brain, which is actually at the back, where we see a lot of this like muscle coordination stuff. You can have problems with this. Like if you have a tumor or a stroke or something that damages that region, you might lose those memories. You might forget how to walk, how to speak, right? Like, what do I do with my tongue when I say onomatopoeia? I have no idea. And I literally just did it. Those are all procedural memories. They're like muscle memories. And those are things that you do learn to do. Babies have to learn how to walk. They have to learn how to speak. They're not sure what to do with their mouths and tongue. This is something that you have done that you're not aware of because these procedural memories are entirely subconscious. Just to like take a second though, that like the stroke stuff, I actually think that of all the long-term memories to lose, the patients I've seen that have lost implicit or procedural memories, those are the most frustrated. Because like if you don't remember like your address where you grew up, or you don't remember like the state capitals or what year it is, that's not quite as frustrating as like I don't know how to walk or speak anymore. I don't know how to like feed myself, like what to do with my hand and how to get my hand to my mouth. Like that's something, especially if you still have all of your episodic memories, you remember walking, you remember eating and talking, but you can't remember how to do it. And that's like insanely frustrating, just kind of overall. And so that's something you see with a lot of like stroke victims. They like have to relearn how to speak or walk or things like that because they have lost some of those procedural memories.
Yeah. And with strokes, it can get a little complicated, right? Because it can affect so many different parts of the brain. And so what Phil's talking about, like losing those basic components of daily living, right? That's why that can get so frustrating. You also think, and so you hinted at this, but we'll talk about it more in a different podcast, but like speech production, right? So there's the component where our mind puts together words, right, into a grammatically correct, or in some of our cases, semi-grammatically correct sentence. And then there's the physical process of how does my mouth form the individual letters, the individual words, right? So those are two distinct processes, but they're also so intertwined.
Yeah.
And so you can have something that affects both of these. And clinically, right, there may be times where it's important to differentiate. There'll be times where you're just trying to treat everything at once. But in terms of, studying this now, it's useful because when you get into, and, we're always trying to remind you, what your ultimate goal is. When you get into medical school, though, you have to be able to parse these things out, and you have to be able to differentiate, okay, what's coming from where, so that I know what would be my differential, right? What are potential diagnoses for this, but also what are potential treatments for this compared to this other phenomenon.
Right. There's a big difference between patients who have forgotten words and patients who have forgotten how to make words. And like, that's hard to tell the difference of because they can't speak. And so it's like, how do you kind of like figure those things out? But it's very interesting. I do want to pause here. This, like how memory works, this isn't like a completely solved thing. That's why I love neuro, is because like when we go to like cardiology, like how does the heart work? Like we pretty much understand every facet of how the heart works. When it comes to the brain, I feel like all the like high level neuro textbooks are like every other sentence is like, oh, and then we think there's something going on with this. And like, we're not really sure. That's why I was like so interested in neurological things. And one of the reasons for that is we don't have good model organisms for like language and memory. And like, it's hard to test like remembering like grammar and syntax when there's no other organism that has grammar and syntax at the level of a human. And so that's hard to understand how that works versus like a dog heart, a pig heart, a monkey heart, like a gerbil heart. They all pretty much work on the same principles as a human heart. But the way that we figure this out is because people will have accidents, like Phineas Gage that blew the railroad spike through his prefrontal cortex. Or you might have patients who have strokes, or patients who have surgeries to remove different regions of their brain. For example, HM, a very famous patient. And I want to talk about HM here for a second, because HM had I believe it was a bilateral hippocampal-ectomy. So he like removed his hippocampus and I think amygdala, like a lot of that like limbic system was removed in this patient on both sides of the brain. And this patient developed amnesia. Now we kind of hinted at this. There's a difference between like different types of amnesia. If you lose the ability to retrieve memory, you can still make the memories, but you can't pull them up. And so that could be like a retrograde amnesia, like you've forgotten your past. That information is still there, but I can't pull it up, right? Actually, like having a problem with retrieval or storage is pretty similar. Like this information from my childhood I stopped storing it. So just like, that's like I took my filing cabinet and threw it away. Like I don't have that information anymore, versus a problem with retrieval, which is like I can't open that filing cabinet and get the stuff out. That's also a problem. Generally, having an issue with retrieval, you have a better outcome than if you have a problem with storage, because the brain can rewire and you can figure out like how to access that information, which is there somewhere, which is why a lot of times when patients who have amnesia, a lot of the time physicians will be like, well, there's a chance it'll come back, and just kind of like give it some time, because that would be more of a problem with the retrieval and your brain will figure out how to retrieve that. Versus if you had a problem with storage, then that information's gone. And so like, that's like, even if your brain rewires, that information is no longer there. And so that information won't come back. But those would both be retrograde amnesia, the inability to remember like stuff that you had encoded. There are patients who have issues with encoding. And so those patients can't make new memories. They can't put anything in the filing cabinet anymore, to use that analogy, probably overuse that analogy. But HM, he developed anterograde amnesia, specifically of the explicit or declarative memory. So if you act like he couldn't learn new facts, he couldn't learn or remember experiences. So like if you took him to Little Rock, the state capital of Arkansas, that's one thing all of you guys are going to learn by the end of the podcast. And then you like took him home and you asked him like, what did you do today? He couldn't tell you because he can't make new episodic memories. His old memories were still there. And so if you asked him like, where do you live? Like he would tell you where he lived. I think it was like Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin. I think it was somewhere like colder in general. But what's really cool is this is one of the ways we learned about these different types of memory, that there was a physician group, I think it was in Arizona, that asked him to move down to Arizona with him so that they could do research on his memory stuff. And this was a problem because like it's hard to make that deal with him because he won't remember making that deal and like ironing out all the like stuff like that's really hard to do. And so I can't remember all of the details, but I think he had a significant other and him and the significant other moved to Arizona and they developed some habits. Like they would get up and they would like walk around the lake every morning. They'd come in and HM would sit down and watch TV and the significant other would like start to cook. And this kind of like process happened where they would do this every day. It was like a really interesting thing that if you took HM outside and said, which house is yours? He would say, none of these houses are mine. It's really hot. Why is it so hot? Because he thinks he's still in Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin or wherever he was actually from. Because he didn't remember moving. He didn't remember getting that house. He didn't remember moving his stuff in. But one day, the significant other was sick. And so HM got up, he went for a walk around the lake, came back in, opened his front door, sat down and turned on the TV. And if you think about that for a second, that is mind blowing because he doesn't know that he lives there because like the moment he walks away from the house, he doesn't know where he lives. But his procedural memory was intact. And so he was able to develop new habits, those like things that you do without thinking. I'm sure all of you guys who like drive a lot have done those things where you're like highway hypnosis and you're like, I don't remember driving for the last 30 minutes, but I made all the right turns because you're just used to doing that procedure. And that actually turns into a procedural memory. You're not really aware of it. Well, like when I'm like, oh, with driving, like when you're first learning to drive, you have to like figure out like, how do I turn on the blinker? What do I do with my feet? Those are things that as you drive enough, you stop thinking about those. They become subconscious procedural memories. You just do them like when you speak or walk. But HM was able to develop those procedural memories. So he would just kind of go on autopilot and walk around the lake, come in, sit down, turn on the TV. But if you took him outside and asked him what house was his, he wouldn't know. And so this is like a super interesting thing that has given us a lot of understanding of these different types of memory and like the difference between implicit and explicit memories. I think even they got HM to eventually play like some video games and like every day they'd be like, hey, like, have you ever played this video game before? And he's like, no. What's a video game? And then they hand him the controller and he'd start to play and he'd be really good because he was able to learn how to play video games, even though he like didn't know what a video game was, because I think his original surgery was in the 50s and they studied him for quite a while. I think it was in the 2000s or the 90s when he actually passed away, but he was like, we were able to learn a whole lot about memory from HM and other people who have had, similar things, tumors, strokes, surgeries, accidents, things like that.
Yeah, there's so much about the mind, like you said, that we're still learning and that we're still unpacking. And the fact that we're able to even start to understand all this is absolutely incredible. Some of you may have noticed that as Phil was talking, he had other thoughts coming to mind and other examples that he had coming to mind. And so that's actually another term related to memory that you need to know for the MCAT, and that's spreading activation. So it's the idea that when you have one memory and it's going to, or one node, right, that's activated, it's going to activate other related nodes. And so you'll notice that we do this quite often, where we're just like, oh yes, this other thought, and then, oh, there's something else that's connected. And I like talking about this, not into a lot of detail because it's not, it's a smaller detail on the MCAT. But it's just a reminder that our minds can do amazing things, hold a vast amount of information. And that even though, we've said this, and psychosocial really does get a bad rap on the MCAT, but it's so applicable to daily life because this is something that you do and that happens on a regular basis. Every single time you have a conversation, you're probably like, oh, wait a second, I had this other thought that I want to say. So we encourage you to take the time and go through the different topics for the psychology and the sociology section. We're going to walk you through some of the bigger ones, right? Some of these higher yield ones and the ones that are more easily adaptable to the podcast setting compared to some other ones. But we really do encourage you to go through the terms on the content outline, on the AAMC's outline, the way that we're going through them. That's how you're going to get the most out of your studying, making sure that you create memories with stories, with active working elaboration, right? Maintenance rehearsal when it's shorter term, and then encoding it into longer term memory. But this is long term. You guys are here because you are going into a profession that is lifelong learning, right? Memorization, incorporation of new information, incorporation of new experiences, like Phil was saying. So getting a leg up on knowing how it works doesn't hurt.
Yeah. That like spreading activation, just really just connecting ideas to each other. So not only do we have these like huge filing cabinets filled with all this information that we've learned in our lifetimes, but they're all kind of connected. And so making those connections is really useful because that's how the MCAT tests things. They like to blend topics. And so think about like, how does this relate to that? So you could have like a passage about like driving and like what's going on with that. And like, I was just thinking about like, driving as like a procedural memory as you remember where to turn. But my brain also went like, wait a minute, like when you learn to drive, that takes a lot of effort. Most people don't remember learning to walk or learning to speak, but they remember learning to drive. And so that's them acquiring that procedural memory that doesn't require any thought now. And like that's that, like I wasn't like intending to go there, but that's something that like the spreading activation occurs where you like start to connect the different topics. I think that that's a pretty useful thing. I always love in class when the students like chime in and like, wait, is this kind of like what's going on with that? I'm like, yes, that is a great connection. And every once in a while, I'll have a student that makes a connection like between different ideas that I'm like, you know what? I didn't even think about that, but you're right. That's a fantastic example of both of these different scenarios and phenomena. And that's when, students are really starting to get it, when they're starting to apply this and try to connect it to new things. And I think that is a really important thing overall, trying to accrue all of this knowledge. I can't think of another like career that has to memorize more information than medicine. Maybe if you do like tax codes or something, but like medicine is like constantly changing with new drugs and new research and things like that. And so every year you have to like learn new stuff. You can't it's a big pile to begin with that you got to memorize, and then it's constantly changing. And so I think tax code, like if you were a tax lawyer, is probably the only thing I could think of that would be like similar of like, you got to learn a whole bunch and then it keeps changing. You have to keep relearning it.
Yeah. I would not want to do that.
Yeah. Well, you kind of are.
Plenty of respect to the people who can do that. Also, just because it comes to mind, and I think I had it earlier in my head. This was a thought earlier in my head. Learning to do the physical exam. So when you start getting into medical school and you start learning the physical exam, it is daunting. Let me just tell you that from the get-go. But eventually you get into a rhythm where you start learning why you do certain maneuvers, right? So you're actively encoding that into your long-term memory, but eventually some parts of it become procedural. Right. So if you think about, so one of the maneuvers that you'll do is percussing. And so you're essentially tapping your finger with another finger. I don't go and think, okay, I'm going to flick my wrist at this, with this strength, at this angle, et cetera. It's automatic now. And so as you learn, yes, there's, don't let us terrify you into not doing medicine. Yes, you are learning so much, but a lot of this will go from one type of memory, it can go into another. You have that memory encoded in different forms, right? You'll see it again and again. And so you get better at it because some of it just comes more naturally. And so it's something that's really annoying to hear. And I can't tell you how many times I just wanted to scream when they told me, oh, you'll get better at it. It comes naturally, more practice, but it really is true. So as you use information when you're, when you store that information, you use it more often, you review it more often, then it does get easier. And so that's another reason why you should continue to review the information that you go through when studying for the MCAT.